There are a couple things that I would like to share with you before I start my presentation, and that is I want to say thank you to the veterans, especially the 4,000 veterans who came up to Standing Rock to stand with the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota people. That was really, for myself, that was really encouraging to see, our allies and supporters coming like that. Because our people, again, I just have tremendous admiration and respect for the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota who showed tremendous courage. They were unarmed and they were facing white men with guns and full riot gear, shields, and beating the crap out of our people and using grenades and water, sound devices, and people being taken out of the inipi lodges and women being taken out of the prayer circles, and talk about, like suppression of religion. That was going on there at Standing Rock, and it really impacted me. And I have to admit that I was really disappointed. In fact, I was quite angry with the establishment Democrats. I saw none of them coming out there. There's Franken, who is a member of the Senate Select Committee on Indian Affairs in the Senate, and he didn't bother to come out. And it was after the 4,000 veterans came out there that he finally contacted Loretta Lynch and said maybe she should begin an investigation. And then Hillary Clinton never did come out, and some of the youth, Native youth, went to New York City and held a protest right out of her office, and she finally issued a wishy-washy statement that said both sides need to be heard. That sounded like Trump after that Charlottesville. I mean, I laugh because it's easier to laugh than cry. And so it was very sickening, and so like for me, that was a turning point for me in my political allegiances. I withdrew from the Democratic Party, and that year then I voted, 2016, I voted for Dr. Jill Stein of the Green Party because she showed up. She showed up at Standing Rock. And Bernie Sanders, I mean, although he was identified with the Democrats really didn't accept him, and the establishment Democrats sabotaged his campaign. So that was really a turning point for me. And of course, I don't expect anything from Republicans. I mean, to me, I just view them as racists, white supremacists, hate mongers, and anti-anything that would benefit indigenous peoples and other peoples of color. So I thank the veterans for this. And then I wanted to say this as well. I got invited to speak at Peace Talk, put on by the Veterans for Peace down there in Red Wing, Minnesota. And I thought, well, one of the things in my retirement, our people will say, I am now 78 winters. And so in my retirement years, there's three things that I am engaged in. One is to do truth-telling, and to do so fearlessly. Another thing is to engage in justice, taking the form of economic justice, like payment for the stolen lands, like this land that we're on. We haven't been paid for it according to the Treaty of 1805. And then the third thing is to work for mutual respect. And I know that all three of them are impossible dreams. They will never be fulfilled. But I think the hardest, the most impossible, if I can use that degree or that kind of word, is working for mutual respect. And why do I say that? Because I have discovered in my 78 winters that the attitude, the white supremacist attitude is solidly embedded in the psyche of the U.S. Euro-American, and I don't think that's ever going to change. Now that's what I think, and so that's why I say that's probably the most impossible of these three dreams. Maybe some truth-telling might occur. And I think if anybody's going to tell the truth, it's probably going to be you guys that are here, the veterans that might start telling the truth. As it is, you're telling the truth about what the U.S. has done in other countries to other peoples, because I view the United States as a militantly imperialistic nation, picking on weaker and vulnerable nations and threatening and intimidating them, that the United States is really good at that. And I echo the sentiments of my fellow Dakota academic. His name is Vine Deloria Jr., and he says similar things like that in his Custer Died for Your Sins. Then I want to say this about this land that we're on right now. It's land involved in the Treaty of 1805, and this is stolen lands. It has not been paid for. And so I've been involved with a guy named Jim Anderson and other people, and we're having fissions, exercising our treaty fishing rights under the Article 3 of that Treaty of 1805 to do all things as we have formerly done in said district. That's Article 3, what it says. Really clear. Do all things as we have formerly done in said district. And so we did this. And like for myself, I was hauled off to jail and appeared in federal court at least 4 times, but Jim, a lot more than that, and my younger daughter, Dr. Wazia Tomi, who's a prolific author, wrote her most recent book is What Does Justice Look Like? And then even my granddaughter, she's been in jail more times than me. So anyway, but I just wanted to, that's something I really firmly believe in. And that's something for me, because I'm a Dakota man, because it's Dakota a treaty, because this is Dakota homelands. This is something I'm willing to fight for, and I'm willing to face white men armed with guns. And we did that all the time in all these fissions that we had. We faced white men armed with guns. I told veterans at Red Wing, I said, you know, I usually don't like to be around U.S. soldiers. But I said, I think you Veterans for Peace, I don't mind being around you guys. At least you treated me pretty good and you're not shooting me. So I like that. Okay, so I wanted to say that about the Treaty of 1805. And then also one personal note. And I had many relatives that were involved in the various genocidal atrocities, incidents that occurred back in the 1862s and in its aftermath. People who fought against the United States government and fought for our homelands, to keep the white man from stealing our lands, to protect our lands, protect our freedom to worship as we please, speak our language as we please, and to live our life as we had lived for millennia, to protect our sacred sites, to protect our burial sites. All of these things. I had relatives who fought like that. I had relatives who were in the forced march of 150 miles from southwestern Minnesota to the concentration camp at Fort Snelling. I had relatives who were in the camp. I had relatives who were part of the forcible removal that the state of Minnesota and its legislature authorized. Forcible removal of the original inhabitants of this land from our ancient homelands. That's the kind of government that we have, the United States government. It is, from my point of view, the United States government is a corrupt nation. It's morally bankrupt because of the things it has done to indigenous peoples. And the last thing is the Treaty of 1851 that was signed at Traverse des Sioux. That was signed with two of the fires, the Sisseton, dwellers by the fish campground, and then my group, my fire, the Wahpeton, dwellers in the leaves, or white people say Wahpeton. There's a town in North Dakota called Wahpeton, right off Interstate 29. And then there's a town, my dad was a Sisseton or Sisseton. There's a town in South Dakota, northeastern South Dakota, that's called Sisseton, South Dakota. So it's a lot of these names of our fires, they're reflected in place names in the state of Minnesota. But the thing I wanted to say is I had a relative who was the first signature on that treaty. It involved 24 million acres in southern Minnesota. This was some of the richest farmland, not only in the state of Minnesota, not only in the United States, but perhaps also in the world. Some of the richest farmland here, southern Minnesota, and my great-great-grandfather, his name was Iangmani, running walker. If you look at the treaty, you'll see his name as the first signature. Now, it's a dubious honor because all it means is he was the first one to get screwed by the United States government. Okay. Genocidal aspects, papal bulls, the doctrine of discovery, the Great Commission, and the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And again, I'll give my usual greeting, ho mitakuyapi, oas inchantewashte napechiusapido. And as I said before, in the language of the first Minnesotans, the Dakota people, this is a greeting which means, hello, my relatives. With a good heart, I greet all of you with a handshake, unquote. As a Dakota man who was born and raised in our ancient Dakota homelands, I welcome all of you who have come from afar to our homelands, Minnesota Makoche, land where the waters reflect the skies. That's my translation, Mato Numpa's translation. Another fellow Dakota, another fellow member of who is a Wahpeton, a dwellers in the leaves, his fire, his name was Dr. Charles Eastman. He defined Minnesota Makoche as land of sky blue waters, and I made a joke about that earlier. And I discovered that many of you are familiar with that slogan, in the land of sky blue waters, Anyway, both definitions refer to the thousands upon thousands of lakes here in the north central region of the United States. Also, the site of our Genesis is right here where the Minnesota River intersects with the Mississippi River. And when I use that word Genesis, I want to credit Jim Anderson, because I heard it was he that said that site is the site of our Genesis and the site of our genocide, where the Minnesota River meets the Mississippi. And I will mention a little more about that a little later. Anyway, I mentioned the Wahpeton, the dwellers in the leaves, and the Bidewakantua, the dwellers by Mystic Lake. These are two fires of the Ochetishakoi, that is the 7 fires of the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, Oyate, the Dakota people or nation. Also, the name of Minnesota, the state name, is derived from our ancient name for our Dakota homelands, Minnesota Makoche. Papal bulls, the doctrine of discovery, genocide, and the indigenous peoples of the Americas. There are 3 papal bulls that I would like to mention and discuss briefly. bulls which had disastrous and genocidal implications for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. One is the Papal Bull of 1455. Secondly, the Papal Bull Inter Caetera of 1493, from which the doctrine of discovery is derived. And finally, the Papal Bull of 1537. As I discuss these papal bulls, I will mention the 1948 UN Genocide Convention, also the 4 common motives for genocide of Frank Chalk and Kurt Jonassen, 2 genocide scholars, and also the Great Commission of Christianity, in which I'll say more later in the presentation. The Great Commission, which was commanded by Jesus Christ to his disciples. Then I will discuss specifically the genocidal aspects of these papal bulls and how they relate to the 1948 UN Genocide Convention and the 4 common motives for genocide. Number 1, the papal bull Romanus Pontifex of 1455 was pronounced by Pope Nicholas V on January 8, 1455. This bull directed the Catholic kings and princes, quote, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans and infidels whatsoever and other enemies of Christ, unquote. Note the terms vanquish and subdue, which suggests war and killing. Also, the term Saracens means Muslims. Although this papal bull was written in 1455, 37 years before Columbus stumbled in 1492 upon the islands of the native peoples of the Caribbean, these terms and phrases, such as pagans, infidels, and other enemies of Christ, would definitely refer and include the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Also, this bull endorsed slavery for all pagans, including the native peoples of the Americas. That is, quote, to reduce their person to perpetual slavery, unquote. This is a papal bull of Pope Nicholas V from the Roman Catholic Church. It was a bull with fearful, threatening, and calamitous consequences for the First Nations people of the U.S., Canada, and of the Americas. This papal bull, Romanus Pontifex of Pope Nicholas V, meant the imposition of a religious ideology, Christianity, upon the unlucky individuals who would happen to be in the paths of these Catholic kings, princes, and missionaries. One sentence called for, quote, the defense and increase of the faith, and another called for the salvation of souls, and another called for the increase of the faith, unquote. Number 2, the papal bull, the Inter Caetera of 1493. Now, I never heard anybody pronounce that Caetera, so I've learned from my teaching that if no one else knows how to pronounce the word, then what I do is pronounce it as with my authoritative voice. And so that's what I'm saying, Caetera, 1493, and I stand to be corrected on that, was issued by Pope Alexander VI on May 4th, 1493. One of the key phrases in this particular bull is, quote, the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for and barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. Other similar phrases are, quote, to bring them to the Catholic faith, and to lead the peoples to embrace the Christian religion, unquote, and quote, to instruct the aforesaid inhabitants in the Catholic faith, unquote, etc., etc. Note the phrase, barbarous nations be overthrown, would definitely refer to the native peoples of the Caribbean, peoples which Columbus had just stumbled upon. These indigenous peoples were to be, quote, overthrown, unquote, and also brought to the faith itself. This preceding phrase would indicate the forcing upon, coercing, and imposing the religious ideology of Christianity upon the First Nations peoples. In addition, the true Catholic kings and princes were to, quote, seek out and discover. Notice that word, discover. Certain islands and mainlands, remote and unknown. And if the lands were not inhabited or claimed by another Christian nation, then the lands were given and assigned to the discoverer and his heirs and successors, unquote. However, if the lands were, quote, in the actual possession of any Christian king or prince, unquote, their rights were to be respected and thus not, quote, withdrawn or taken away, unquote. Thus, the native peoples, since they were pagans, infidels, and enemies of Christ, and even though they may have lived on these lands for millennia, were considered to have no rights to their own lands. As a result, the lands could be legally stolen by the authority of this papal bull of 1493 and Pope Alexander VI. This basically is the foundation for the doctrine of discovery. If you look at this from the point of view of the Christians, they would say it was, quote, holy theft, unquote, and thus it is okay. By the way, I wanted to say, somebody mentioned that Lutherans and Methodists and Episcopalians and other denominations were calling for the revocation and to rescind this papal bull and the doctrine of 1493 and this doctrine of discovery from which it is derived. Anyway, I had to chuckle at that because of course Protestants would do that. It's just those damn Catholics, so hell, we can do that. But ask the Methodists to return some of the stolen lands. Ask Lutherans to return some of the stolen lands. Ask Presbyterians to return. Now that's different. That's okay. Okay. Dr. Stephen Newcomb, who founded the Indigenous Law Institute, says that what he calls, quote, the empire domination model is referring to the doctrine of discovery. This, quote, presumes that it is justifiable for an immigrant sovereign like Spain, Portugal, England, or France to presume the right to militarily take over a country by force and to put the original inhabitants under the foreign rule of the empire builders, unquote. Think Papal Bull of 1455, with its granting the right to invade, vanquish, and subdue all pagans and other enemies of Christ. This papal bull of 1493 by Pope Alexander VI is, to quote Dr. Newcomb again, quote, reflective of a language system which presumes that it is permissible for one people to assume a divine right of empire and domination over another people, unquote. It is no wonder that most First Nations peoples would like to see this papal bull, especially the doctrine of discovery, rescinded or revoked. And of course, right after I get done talking, you are going to hear why some Native youth, under the guidance of Mitakoda, my friend, Mitch Walking Elk, went to the Vatican to ask that the Pope revoke the, quote, doctrine of discovery. Number 3, the Sublimis Dei by Pope Paul III, May 29th, 1537. This bull addressed the evangelization and enslavement of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Pope Paul III said this in his bull: "Hence Christ, who is the truth itself, and has never failed and can never fail, said to the preachers of the faith, 'Go ye and teach all nations.'" A modern translation renders this same verse, Matthew chapter 19, or chapter 28, verse 19, thusly, quote, "Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations." A Catholic version, the New American Bible, says, quote, "Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations," unquote. The New English Bible, as well as other modern translations, says the same thing. This particular verse, a commandment of Jesus Christ, is called the Great Commission by the Christian Church. Thus, the Christian Church sends missionaries all over the globe to make disciples of all the nations. This command of Jesus Christ is a command to proselytize, to convert, and to impose Christianity upon the victim group or groups. A non-Christian, such as myself, would say that Jesus Christ is an advocate of religious imperialism, that Jesus Christ is a religious imperialist. Also, this particular papal bull declared that we, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, were, quote, truly men. Thanks, Pope Paul. And that we were not only capable of understanding the Catholic faith, but that we desired exceedingly to receive it. Pope Paul III said another interesting thing, that we, the indigenous peoples, be able, quote, to enjoy their liberty and the possession of their property, that is, our lands. And, quote, nor should they be in any way enslaved, unquote. It's too bad that the rest of the Catholic Church and the rest of Christianity did not adhere to this papal bull. The good Christian Western European and the good Christian U.S. Euro-Americans stole all our lands and made us slaves anyway. All three papal bulls, Romanus Pontifex, Inter Caetera, and Sublimis Dei, called for, in addition to the subduing and vanquishing of pagans, infidels, and other enemies of Christ, the spreading of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and for evangelization of the world, including the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Genocidal aspects, the Great Commission, the papal bulls, and the doctrine of discovery. In this section, I would like to make some comments and share some observations re the genocidal aspects as it relates to the Great Commission of Jesus Christ, the three papal bulls, and the doctrine of discovery, which are mentioned above. I begin with the Great Commission found again in Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28, verse 19, which reads, "Go therefore and make disciples of all of the nations." This is the New King James Version. I consulted some 19th century Protestant, evangelical, and fundamentalist theologians. Here are several of their quotations. Matthew Henry, a Presbyterian, says, "To disciple all nations, do your utmost to make the nations Christian nations." He also said, quote, that Christianity should be twisted in with national constitutions, not unlike what the Christian right wishes to do here in the United States. Three theologians, Robert Jameson and David Brown, both Presbyterians, and Andrew Fawcett, Church of England or Anglican, about Matthew, or Episcopalian, as they say here in the United States. By the way, my father was an Episcopal lay reader, and I was baptized an Episcopalian. So I was, in a past life, deep into the darkness of Christianity. I thought some of you might get a kick out of that. Okay. These three theologians, they only reiterate making disciples of all nations. And Adam Clarke, a Methodist, says that teach, that's used in the King James Version, means to make disciples of all nations. All Christians who believe in the command, this command, do support, train, and send out missionaries all over the world to do exactly what Christ commands. It is difficult for this writer to not say that Jesus Christ wishes to impose Christianity upon and to make all nations and its peoples a Christian theocracy. At this point in the presentation, I would like to bring up Frank Chalk and Kurt Jonason's 4 common motives for genocide. Both Chalk and Jonason are genocide scholars, and genocide is one of my research interests. And I give talks all over the world on genocide, and not only the Dakota people of Minnesota, but also the genocide of the indigenous peoples of the United States. And they're the genocide scholar, and there are 4 common motives. Number 1, to eliminate groups of people who the perpetrators imagine are threats. Number 2, to spread terror among the enemies. That would be like Columbus. If for native peoples who didn't bring in their monthly quota of gold, cut off their hands and leave it hanging by a wisp of flesh and say, you go back and tell them this is what is going to happen if you don't obey what we say. Terror, to spread terrors among the enemies. Number 3, to acquire economic wealth. And 4, to impose an ideology or belief upon the victim group. Most of you know where I'm going with that one. And all 4 of these motives are evident in the U.S. and Western European genocides against the indigenous peoples of not only North America, but also of all the Americas. The 4th common motive for genocide, to impose an ideology or a belief upon the victim group, is particularly germane to this discussion. Jesus Christ's command to make disciples of all nations implies such words as coerce or compel. Also, the term impose means to force or forcing on or forcing upon. Thus, Christ's command, quote, to make disciples of all nations, fulfills Chalk and Jonason's 4th common motive for genocide, to impose an ideology, namely Christianity, upon the victim group. It is Jesus Christ whose commands fulfills this motive for genocide. This would mean, it seems, that the Christian churches and congregations, priests, pastors, ministers, bishops, cardinals, and all of the followers of Jesus Christ are complicit in the enterprise of genocide. This would seem to make Jesus Christ as an advocate of genocide. If so, then this makes Jesus Christ the genocidaire in chief. Furthermore, this would make the Roman Catholic Pope, the representative of Christ on planet Earth, also complicit in genocide. By the way, a genocidaire is a term I learned when I spoke at the Genocide Conference in Kigali, Rwanda. That is a French term, but it means a genocidaire is a perpetrator of genocide. One example of how this imposition of religious ideology of Christianity played out with indigenous peoples concerns a native man named Hatui. I quote from David Stannard's book, American Holocaust, page 70. Quote, "The Spanish found Hatui, a leader and his people, killed most of them, enslaved the others, and condemned their leader to be burned alive. Reportedly, as they were tying him to the stake, a Franciscan friar urged him to take Jesus to his heart so that his soul might go to heaven rather than descend into hell. Hatui replied that if heaven was where the Christians went, he would rather go to hell," unquote. A wise, go ahead, good. A wise man, Hatui. I would like to add here that Columbus and his Christian soldiers killed in 21 years 8 million indigenous peoples by violence, disease, and despair. It was a genocidal, mass-murdering tragedy and trauma that resulted from the papal bulls, from the doctrine of discovery, which was derived from the papal bull of 1493, and from the Great Commission of Jesus Christ. This is all part of what I call the Woshicha Tunkaki, the great evil that was to occur in the 526 years the invaders, killers, and destroyers have been here in the Americas. By the way, I got a book that I just finished that is at the publisher now, and I just found out from the publisher it'll come out in September of next year, 2019. But it's called, I use this phrase, Woshicha Tunkaki, and then in parentheses, the great evil, genocide, the Bible, and the indigenous peoples of the United States. But basically what that does is that of the genocidal massacres that occurred over the, especially in the first 4 centuries, that the killers of us would quote Bible verses before, during, or after a genocidal massacre to justify not only killing us, but stealing our lands, suppressing our religions, and enslaving us as well. And that's what the book is about, the great evil. In addition to the physical killing or murder of native peoples, genocide was perpetrated by establishing residential boarding schools for our indigenous youth. One of the philosophies for such schools, as articulated by Captain Richard H. Pratt, was kill the Indian and save the man, unquote, delivered in a speech titled History Matters in 1892 at George Mason University. The purpose of the schools was to educate, civilize, assimilate, and Christianize the native person. So Christianity and the church, in addition to advocating the physical killing of the indigenous man, endorsed in several papal bulls, were now also going to kill spiritually and emotionally the native being. So both the U.S. government and Christianity operated residential boarding schools founded by both Catholics and Protestants. Here is a statement by a Roman Catholic bishop in regard to, quote, the goal of the residential school, unquote. Quote, we instill in them a pronounced distaste for the native life so that they will be humiliated when reminded of their origin. When they graduate from our institutions, the children will have lost everything native except the blood, unquote. in 1875. The name of this racist bishop was Bishop Vital Grandin. The Vatican eventually made this white supremacist Bishop Grandin a saint. See, for us, it's hard for me how they could do that. But for them, he's a Catholic. So that means he's a holy man, and he's a priest. Holy man. So it's okay, I guess. According to the fifth criterion, E, of the 1948 UN Genocide Convention, the use of boarding schools is an act of genocide. This fifth criterion reads, quote, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, unquote. Where I live in southwestern Minnesota, at the junction of Federal Highway 212 and State Highway 23, that 75 miles from there is Pipestone, Minnesota, and that was where not only an Indian hospital was located, but also a boarding school. And my mother was forcibly taken from our community and transferred over there where she had to stay for the year. But fortunately, she got to come home in the summertime. But others say, like going from South Dakota to the residential boarding school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, 1,000 miles or so, they weren't so lucky. Sometimes some of them were kept anywhere 3, 4, 5 years, 10 years, even 14, 15 years. And some of them died there. So a lot of the residential boarding schools had cemeteries where the native students were buried. I don't think Pipestone had one, though. Maybe they did, but I don't think so. There was another Roman Catholic priest worth mentioning here who was similar in character to Bishop Vital Grandin. His name was Father Junipero Serra of the Franciscans. Father Junipero and the Franciscans founded and ran their missions like slave camps. Quote, they starved and worked their would-be converts to death, while the diseases they and others had imported killed off thousands more, unquote. Then the native peoples would be punished severely when they did something wrong. Before natives were killed or died from diseases, they were required to attend Mass in the chapels so that they could be, quote, spiritually prepared, unquote, to die. While in the chapels, to make sure they obeyed, they were guarded by men with whips and by soldiers with fixed bayonets. Father Serra and the Franciscans, as good shepherds of the flock, wanted to ensure that their sheep would go to heaven instead of to hell. Such consideration, huh? This Father Serra was named as a candidate for sainthood in the Roman Catholic Church in 1988, and then was made a saint by Pope Francis in September 23rd, 2015, just 3 years ago, in Washington, D.C. As to be expected, the native peoples of California and elsewhere in the United States vigorously objected to this cruel and evil man being designated a saint. I don't know if too many Catholics, though, objected. I don't think they knew their history. And even if they did know their history, a lot of white folk considered native peoples as expendable and sometimes as subhumans. So it'd be just a few thousand less. An example, Mr. Valentin Lopez, chairperson of the Matsun tribal band, expressed his outrage in a letter to California Governor Jerry Brown, writing, quote, canonizing Junipero Serra effectively condones and celebrates his use of imprisonment and torture to convert California Indians to Christianity, unquote. Other Native peoples also objected to the same forceful methods, the beatings, the starving, the terrorizing, and use of corporal punishment, working them to death, etc., that Father Serra used in trying to convert the indigenous peoples of California to the Catholic faith. In so doing, Father Junipero Serra perpetrated genocide, fulfilling at least two criteria of the 1948 UN Genocide Convention. Criterion A, killing members of the group. And criterion C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And this is in reference to the slave camps, starving and working them to death. Also, Father Serra perpetrated genocide with his Christian missions by imposing a religious ideology, Christianity, upon the victim group, thus fulfilling criteria 4 of Chalk and Jonason's 4 common motives for genocide, imposing an ideology or belief upon the victim group. The perpetration of genocide upon the indigenous peoples of California was my principal objection to the beatification or the state of sainthood upon Father Serra by Pope Francis. I am guessing that cruel and brutal genocidal priests are okay in Pope Francis' thinking. Conclusion. Since the beginning of the great evil, some 526 years ago, much sorrow and suffering has befallen the indigenous peoples of not only the United States, but also of the Americas. The doctrine of discovery, the Great Commission, the 3 papal bulls I have mentioned in this presentation have been significant factors in the death and destruction of the First Nations peoples. The doctrine of discovery from the papal bull of 1493 endorsed legal stealing of newly discovered lands, that this resulted in a massive land theft in the United States, for one example. Since all the lands in the Americas before 1492 were occupied by indigenous peoples or non-Christians or pagans or infidels or other infidels of Christ or other enemies of Christ, we had no right to our own lands according to the doctrine of discovery. So when Columbus and the Franciscan missionaries blundered upon the islands of the Caribbean, and since no other Christian nations had claimed the lands were then claimed by Columbus for the country of Spain. This meant that the approximately 3 billion acres which now comprise the United States of America now belong to Jesus, to Pope Alexander VI, who is Jesus' representative on earth, to Columbus, and finally to Spain. Take your pick there. The Great Commission, commanded by Jesus Christ, resulted in massive efforts to make the world a Christian world. Roman Catholic Church is a religious empire. So the disciples and followers went out into all the world and did exactly this. Thus, Christianity fulfilled motive number 4 of the 4 common motives, that is, imposing an ideology or belief upon the victim group. The papal bulls collectively endorsed massive land theft and immense evangelization efforts, and endorsed war, enslavement, and genocide. To reiterate, the papal of 1455 directed the Catholic kings and princes to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue pagans whatsoever, unquote. To vanquish and to subdue means to make war, kill, and conquer. The papal bull Inter Caetera of 1493 contained the phrase that barbarous nations be overthrown. And of course, our native nations were considered barbarous nations. And our peoples were overthrown and killed since we resisted and were conquered. As indicated previously in the islands of the Caribbean in 21 years, approximately 8 million Native peoples were killed by violence, disease, and despair. And just an additional comment, that 8 million is 2 million more than the number of Jews killed in World War II. But who does the U.S. Euro-American Society shed crocodile tears for? The Jews. And I'm not minimizing their genocide. Every genocide is horrific, is terrible. But it just seems like if they can cry for the Jews, why can't they cry for us? But they don't. In the United States, it was estimated that the population of the U.S. in 1500 was around 16 million. Other modern demographers place the estimates quite higher, like in the 20 millions. By 1980, there were only 237,000 plus Native peoples left alive to be counted in the Bureau of Census, and this is in 1900. This was a 98.5% extermination rate. As one writer put it, quote, "There was at last no one left to kill," unquote. Then, in all of the Americas, the number of peoples killed varied anywhere from 110 to 125 million killed. I will close with a quotation from David Stannard's book, American Holocaust, page Roman numeral 10. Quote, "The destruction of the Indians of the Americas was far and away the most massive act of genocide in the history of the world." And that's worth repeating. The destruction of the Indians of the Americas was far and away the most massive act of genocide in the history of the world. And ladies and gentlemen, the Christian religion and Christians had a prominent role in this Holocaust of the Americas. Mitakuyapi, namayach umpiki, he nina piwada, heu, wopida tanka oas echichiapido. My relatives, I appreciate very much your listening to me. So I extend to all of you my deepest appreciation, unquote. Again, thank you.